Hello, my name is John Roskam. I am the Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs, and welcome to the first edition of Encounters, brought to you by the IPA for Institute of Public Affairs members, where we talk to some of the world's leading thinkers and writers about freedom. Today we're delighted to be talking with Lord Sumption. I am coming to you from the Melbourne studios of the Baillieu Myer Media Centre here at the Institute of Public Affairs. Lord Sumption is coming to us from the UK. We have something like 400 members of the IPA watching and listening to us at the moment live. I apologise because we're not going to be able to get through all of your questions about freedom, democracy in the time of COVID, because we have received dozens. What we've done is selected some of the key questions and key themes that have been put to us by IPA members. I'm joined here in the studio in Melbourne by Steve Walsh, Saul Muscatel, Rachel Guy, Stephanie Campbell and Chetna Mahadik. Before I introduce Lord Sumption, can I say a few words about the work and the research of the Institute of Public Affairs over the last 12 months. Our position from 12 months ago, which is our position still today, is that the coronavirus is serious. But at a time of crisis, we must maintain democracy, we must secure our freedoms, and we must ensure the rule of law continues. That hasn't happened in Australia, and it hasn't happened in the UK. We have never accepted the view that the debate about how governments should respond to the pandemic is about the economy versus lives. We understand, we have always maintained, the debate is about lives and lives, livelihoods, our social interactions, and indeed our humanity. Through the work of the IPA, through our research papers, through our podcasts, through our commentary, we have always argued that. The IPA's podcast and video on the social costs of the lockdown, the human costs of the lockdown, has now been viewed more than 500,000 times. In September, here in the state of Victoria, Zoe Buhler was arrested in her pyjamas, in her kitchen, in front of her two young children, by the Victoria Police. She was handcuffed, taken to the police station and charged with incitement. What did Zoe do? She posted on her Facebook page a statement supporting a protest against the lockdown, a protest she thought was legal. What happened to Zoe Buhler should not happen in a free country like Australia. And I know that many IPA members have supported Zoe's case, which will be before the Magistrates Court in the coming weeks. Now let me introduce Lord Sumption. Lord Sumption was a Justice of the UK Supreme Court from 2012 to 2018. He was the first barrister appointed to the UK's highest court straight from the bar without having served in a lower court. As a barrister, he was described by his colleagues as amazing, brilliant, a frightening opponent, and titanic. He appeared in some of the UK's largest and most significant cases, including notably in 2005, defending the then Labor government in the country's largest ever class action. He speaks French, Italian fluently, reads Spanish, Dutch, Portuguese, Catalan, Latin, a little Greek, has been learning German, and has studied Hebrew and Arabic. Lord Sumption has been described politically as a small C conservative, and he has said of himself some years ago, he's a Tory who has sometimes voted Labor. He has written several books on medieval history, including 4 volumes on the 100 Years' War, the third of which won the 2009 Wolfson History Prize. Lord Sumption, welcome to Encounters.
Glad to be here.
Can I begin by quoting something you said about democracy? It's an important passage. It's a few sentences long. You wrote, "Prophets are usually wrong, but one thing I will prophesy. We will not recognise the end of democracy when it comes. Advanced democracies are not overthrown. There are no tanks on the streets, no sudden catastrophes, no brash dictators or braying mobs. Instead, their institutions are imperceptibly drained of everything that once made them democratic. The labels will still be there, but will no longer describe the contents. The facade will still stand, but there will be nothing left behind. The rhetoric of democracy will be unchanged, but it will be meaningless, and the fault will be ours." What you said, Lord Sumption, is significant. It is also significant that you said that in June 2019. Those were the final words of your final lecture that you delivered for the BBC Reith Lecture series. What has happened in the last 12 months to democracy and freedom in the UK and in Australia? And did you see something like this happening when you penned those words back in 2019?
In the first of my Reith lectures, I identified as one of the critical problems of democracy that it tends to lead to higher expectations of the state. In particular, it tends to lead people to look for security from the state against things, many of which the state cannot secure them. The result is what I have called the Hobbesian bargain. Thomas Hobbes was an apologist for absolute government who wrote in the 17th century. And he believed that human beings in society surrender their liberties absolutely and unconditionally and permanently to the state in return for security. Ever since he wrote, all serious liberals and Democrats have rejected his model. But what we are seeing is its covert acceptance in the way that people currently behave. What I think has happened is that people have been taken over by the empire of fear. And fear causes people to surrender rights and liberties which they would never otherwise have done. It's an open question whether if they surrender them, they can get them back later. I doubt it, but we shall see.
You have spoken eloquently about freedom and about democracy. So if I could talk to you a little bit about democracy. And in the Reith Lectures, published as Trials of the State, Law and the Decline of Politics, you talk about democracy requiring legitimacy and also the notion of equality. Can I ask you to explore that a little bit, particularly in the context that many of the measures seen in the UK and Australia are regarded as illegitimate, and you make the point that legitimacy depends on us not necessarily winning the argument, but at least having a say in the argument, and some of these arbitrary rules and regulations have not allowed the public to express a view.
Legitimacy, I think, involves certainly having a say in the argument, but it also involves a basic respect for the way in which the decisions are made, even if you don't particularly like the outcome. The democracy's biggest problem has always been the one which was pointed out at the very outset of democracy by Aristotle. He regarded democracy as an inherently unstable and self-destructive doctrine or way of governing oneself. And the reason was that it naturally transmuted into despotism. Now, why has that not in fact happened in the 200 years or so since democracies have been the norm in the West and in Europe and in advanced societies? The reason why Aristotle's prediction has not come about until recently is that there is a culture of restraint. There are many things that democracies can do, that majorities can do, many things that the state, with its huge apparatus of technology and information gathering, can do, which there is a consensus that it should not do. And the trouble about this is it's a purely cultural thing. There's no legal barrier. It's an entirely consensual and cultural barrier. Once you cross it, there is no restraint left. And that is, I think, the problem that we've got at the moment.
Is it just fear that has led to that constraint or convention being eroded? Or is it simply, again, as you talk eloquently about, that the state simply, and ministers have simply so much power that they desire to use it?
Yes. I think there's no doubt that power is an immense aphrodisiac. People do not lightly give it up. In the UK, our experience of wartime controls, which were actually a good deal less draconian than the ones that we are suffering from in the UK now, our experience of wartime controls is that the politicians do not give them up. Rationing continued in the UK for 6 years after the end of the war, because there were people who believed ideologically in social control. And some of the wartime powers, which politicians took in 1939, were still being used in 1980. The regulations under which they were introduced actually had a provision which said that these powers will expire as soon as His Majesty declares that the current emergency, that's the Second World War, is over. The politicians simply never put before His Majesty any declaration of that kind, and they were still exercising wartime powers on the basis that the Second World War was in progress in the 1980s. This is a very characteristic problem.
And here in Australia, a number of state premiers, after promising not to undertake steps to extend the state of disaster or the state of emergency, while coronavirus cases in a state like Victoria are zero, have been talking about extending not just government controls, but police controls, local authority controls, almost indefinitely. How do citizens respond to this? And I'll talk to you a little bit about this further because a number of members have asked about this. How is a citizen mindful of their rights to react to what is happening?
There are really only two ways. One is the ballot box, and the other is civil disobedience. I suppose there's a third way. People might just change their mind. Experience suggests that doesn't happen as often as it should. The ballot box is the obvious answer in a democracy. And again, if I can hark back to wartime controls in the UK, the main reason why the Labour Party lost the 1950 and 1951 general elections in this country was that they'd kept rationing in. People supported that in 1945 and 1946 because they felt that the war was an example of what social control could do to achieve collective targets. But they quickly got disenchanted with it. And it was the main reason why the Labour Party lost. So it does work. I am not confident that it will work again on this occasion, because it seems to me that the growing craving for security at the expense of all other values is not just something that has happened in the course of the COVID crisis. It's something that's been building up for very many years without there necessarily being a crisis to provoke it. And for that reason, I think that certainly in Europe, people are unlikely to change their minds quite as quickly as they did in the 1940s. I think they will eventually, but it will take a good deal longer. The other alternative is civil disobedience, but frankly, civil disobedience is unlikely to work unless it involves a very significant part of the population. The reason why it took the Italians some 20 years after they had undertaken to introduce value-added tax to actually introduce it was that nobody turned up in the streets, nobody rioted, they just tore up the forms and did nothing. And that's a highly effective way of demonstrating your view. And sooner or later, if governments persist in locking people down in circumstances where the public generally doesn't think it's necessary, this is going to happen. At the moment in the UK, we have actually vaccinated about 50% of the population, including almost the totality of the vulnerable groups. Nevertheless, the government is not going to let go, and it is persisting in locking us down, in stopping all travel arrangements for 100% of the population, vaccinated or unvaccinated. This is not going to be tolerated for that much longer. I think a milder form of restriction might be tolerated, but if you overdo it, you're basically going to lose public sympathy much more quickly. I confess, I would be glad to see that happen.
Can I then ask you, exploring that question further, one of the questions that quite a number of IPA members asked, and I'll take Susan from Queensland as an example, and this comes to what you were just talking about. If a law or government regulation is clearly arbitrary or ridiculous, as some of the COVID laws and regulations are, and as you've just pointed out applies in the UK, when is it morally defensible to disobey the government?
I think that there's no single answer to that, because it's basically a matter of individual conscience, and people will have different thresholds. I have never believed that there is a moral obligation to comply with the law. It's tautology to say that there's a legal obligation. Of course there is. And if you break the law, you cannot legitimately complain if you get punished. But ultimately, whether you're prepared to take that risk is a matter of individual conscience. It depends on your own moral values, your own sense of vulnerability, and your own view about what the government is doing.
Is it your view that too many people, too many ministers, too many experts have been too invested in the decisions they've made 12 months ago and more recently, and so have been reluctant to acknowledge that perhaps times have changed and that some of the restrictions can be removed, or even that perhaps some of the initial decisions were wrong? Because you have spoken eloquently that something like 10 years ago, the UK government planned for a pandemic of this sort, and in fact, something much worse. And as you've spoken about, the advice then was that people are to be trusted, they are to be trusted to act responsibly, and for the vulnerable to be protected, and for the healthy and young to continue as best as can in as reasonable circumstances as they can. What has changed? Is it because we are invested, no one likes to admit they're wrong, or is there something more happening?
Well, what you've just accurately summarised the UK planning documents, which had been prepared over a period of about 12 years before COVID-19 was ever heard of. What is striking is that isn't an eccentricity of the UK. The Robert Koch Institute in Germany, which produced the German National Pandemic Plan, reads in a very similar way. So does the advice which the World Health Organization consistently gave, and in some respects is still giving, although it's a highly political organization and has wobbled slightly from time to time. So this was in fact the scientific consensus right up to the time when states started to lock down early last year. Why did they throw this policy out the window? It certainly can't be said that they had carefully researched the position and decided that this was a good thing to do. There simply wasn't time to do that. In the UK, the body of scientists known as SAGE, which advises the government, had given advice absolutely in line with the original planning view, right up to the week before the lockdown. And in fact, its minutes, which are published to date, show that they never actually advised that there should be a lockdown. So this was a decision made very swiftly without the benefit of scientific advice. It was a decision which was essentially made for political reasons. What had happened was that China had a very savage lockdown. Italy, which had a particularly serious outbreak in January and February of last year, then instituted a lockdown. It was followed by Spain and France. And people started saying in the UK, if other countries are doing this, then why aren't we doing it? People want government. Yes, well, this is how it very often happens. So what you have is a scientific consensus to precisely the opposite effect to what the government ultimately did. Each country had independently evaluated its position and had previously come to the conclusion that coercion was a bad idea and that you should have targeted rather than indiscriminate restrictions. So each country independently decided that, but they didn't independently decide to jettison it. Each of them copied the other. And they did it basically because they were afraid of their own populations. And they fell for the view that government must act. And some action must be taken is the common response of people who have unbounded faith in the power of the state, even if they have serious doubts about the adequacy of the politicians who actually are the state in human terms. This is a normal human behavior. We rely on politicians, if they have sufficient moral and political stature, to stand up against this kind of thing. And his experience suggests that if you treat people like grown-ups and discuss this in reasonable terms, they can successfully stand up against it. But of course, the essential condition that you need to do that is to have politicians of the necessary moral and political stature.
And talking of politicians brings us to the next question from Melanie from Western Australia. And in Western Australia, the Premier shut the borders to other states and territories in direct contradiction to the Constitution. Melanie asks, can you ask Lord Sumption whether he will move to Perth and help us reopen the borders? But seriously, why aren't there dozens of Lord Sumptions? He seems to be the only lawyer not afraid to speak up. Where are all the human rights lawyers? Now, I understand you would have been asked that question many times. It struck many people, both here and in the rest of the English-speaking world. Why are you one of the few who has bravely, eloquently, articulately spoken up against the consensus?
Well, I have some advantages. I mean, first of all, because of my status as a former senior judge, it's quite difficult to justify shutting me down the way that quite a number of dissenting journalists have been shut down in the United Kingdom. Secondly, I'm retired, and I'm not beholden to anyone. I don't depend on anyone's favour or support. I have no ambitions other than to finish my work on the 100 Years' War and to protest against current lunacies. That's an enviable position to be in. Most people are in a position where whatever their views, they do not want to put their head above the parapet. I have had literally dozens of emails from people since I started talking about this subject, from politicians, from doctors, from specialists in all sorts of fields, from civil servants saying, we agree with you absolutely. We're delighted that you're speaking out because we don't dare to. It's not worth our career.
You have written and spoken about the moral conformity that is now being imposed on society, not just, and you wrote this before coronavirus, but in relation to the imposition of moral values upon the rest of the community. What do those emails say to you about the future for diversity of opinion, the future for people expressing a view? Is there a hope that we can have such discussions, which, as you've said, have basically resulted in not happening because people are cancelling themselves and self-censoring themselves?
Yes, the problem really is that there is a growing feeling, which I reject absolutely, but is very powerful, that on basic moral issues, it is necessary for a society to have a collective view. If you take that view, then clearly dissent is antisocial, indeed treasonable. It's a view of society as a solid block which takes its sounding by majority and the rest of the world must conform. That is not a view consistent with classic liberalism, and indeed it's not a view which is consistent with the advance of truth, because the advance of truth depends on debate. It depends on the ability to confront opposing arguments instead of trying to suppress them. We have had in the UK demands from the most surprising quarters for the suppression of opposition to vaccines. Now, I should say that I have no problem about vaccines. I'm not an opponent of them. I welcome them. And I have had one of the shots and I hope to get the other shortly. So I'm not an anti-vaxxer by any stretch of the imagination. On the other hand, I have to recognize that if ever it does become clear that there are problems about vaccines, it will be because some dissenting heretic, some nuisance person who is grit under the skin of politicians and health administrators will have pointed it out. And if we silence him, we may be denying ourselves an important source of truth. I think that this is a deeply sinister situation. The Royal Society, which is the premier specialist scientific society in the United Kingdom, dates back to the 17th century, recently asked for criminal sanctions against people who sought to oppose the mass use of vaccines. I think that this is an extraordinary betrayal of their intellectual calling.
Are the sources of truth narrowing for society into the future? It had been assumed that with more diversity, better education, mass democracy, there'd be more diversity of opinion, not less. What do you see as the future for diversity of opinion?
I very much fear that long before COVID was heard of, we started moving in the direction that there is a single social view on moral issues. It doesn't apply to issues that are not moral issues, but one has to bear in mind that people are increasingly inclined to examine in moral terms issues which we would previously have regarded as questions of pragmatic management.
Can I ask you one question about the social differences that have emerged from the government's responses to the pandemic before we go to the video questions? And this is from Daniel in South Australia. George Orwell said in 1984, "If there was hope, it must lie in the proles." Why does it appear that the working class...
It must lie in what?
Must lie in the proles, in the proletariat.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
The quote from 1984. Why does it appear that the working class Not the elites, the working class, the middle class are more concerned about freedoms, are more concerned about democracy and our liberties than some of the elites who have traditionally presented themselves as defenders of freedom and liberty and democracy? Or is that a mischaracterisation of the situation, certainly as it appears in Australia and appears to us in the UK?
Well, I wouldn't say that that was true in the UK, and I wouldn't say that it was true in Europe. I can't obviously speak from personal knowledge about Australia. I think that the desire to have a collective response to COVID-19, notwithstanding that different people are very differently affected by it, depending on age, underlying health, all sorts of other factors. It seems to me that the desire to impose a solution is pretty well uniformly spread throughout the educational and social spectrum. I don't think that it is a peculiarly elite thing. Certainly the polls don't suggest as much.
No, and certainly the polls speak to the overwhelming majority of the public supporting governments of whatever persuasion in the measures they're undertaking. Can I?
The interesting exception to that possibly is Sweden. Sweden opinion is pretty evenly divided, but the government has done a very good job in making its very different policies acceptable to a lot of the public.
Have you been surprised by how many people seem to be barracking for Sweden to fail?
Oh, of course. They're desperate that they should fail, and they light upon every indication that it is failing. The Swedish outcome has been a good deal better than the British one, notwithstanding that Sweden is a country whose population densities in its cities is pretty well comparable to that of the United Kingdom. The density of population of Stockholm, where a very high proportion of the population of Sweden live, is about 15% greater than it is in London. What they normally say is, oh, well, they've done much worse than Finland and Denmark. But Finland and Denmark had absolutely nothing to do with it. Finland and Denmark have indeed done extremely well. They've done better than other countries which did have a lockdown, like Germany. It seems to me that whatever the reason for that difference, it's got nothing to do with the basic debate that we ought to be having. And there has been a persistent refusal to confront the Swedish example. Professor Neil Ferguson, the archpriest of lockdown in the United Kingdom, was asked about this early on in some evidence that he gave to the House of Commons in the UK, where it was pointed out to him that his model, when varied to cater for Swedish conditions and run through a computer, it indicated that there ought to have been 20 times as many deaths in Sweden than there actually had been. His response was, Sweden, of course, has had many measures. It's had social distancing, it's had government persuasion, it's had all sorts of things. And of course, he's absolutely right about that. But then we could have been content with that too. It is a very striking thing that nobody in this country will actually confront the Swedish example and ask, why have they not done worse than we have if lockdowns work? It's not just Sweden. Sweden is, in European terms, the most striking example. But of course, we now have a good deal of data which enables us to compare very similar and indeed adjoining states of the United States who have had different lockdown policies. The classic example is North and South Dakota. One of them had a lockdown, the other did not. The results in terms of infections and deaths are indistinguishable.
On that note, can we go to some video questions that have been sent in by IPA members before today? And the first question is from Ian.
Hello, my name is Ian and I live in Victoria. I do have a question for Jonathan Sumption. How strongly has social media catalysed the rise of fear and the dilution of the rule of law? I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you.
Social media have the effect of amplifying whatever people are currently thinking. They amplify the pro-lockdown camp. They amplify the anti-lockdown camp too. But because the pro-lockdown camp is larger, clearly the effect in terms of decibels is that much greater. I think that the problem about social media is that it encourages a herd instinct and correspondingly discourages analysis. And what we above all need in the current crisis is an ability to look carefully at data and to be prepared to change our minds. It really takes me back to what you, John Roskam, said earlier about why has nobody changed their minds. The answer is what is commonly in political psychological terms referred to as the sunk cost fallacy. If you embark on an extremely controversial policy which has unpleasant side effects, you become very quickly committed to it, because it's very difficult for you to say, actually, all these unpleasant side effects, it wasn't worth it. We've achieved nothing. That's a very difficult thing to say. It requires enormous courage. And it's what's happened to the scientific community that advised governments, although not to the ones that have retained their independence. And above all, it's what's happened to ministers.
The next question is from Bernard on some of the legal issues and the future of legal issues around what's occurred.
Hello, my name is Bernard and I'm from Queensland. My question for Lord Sumption is, COVID-19 has changed the legal landscape. What are some positive changes to the law which have emerged as a result of COVID-19?
Have there been any?
Well, I don't believe there have been any as a result of COVID-19. I think that when you look at legal remedies, you have to look at two completely different issues. One is whether the government actually has the power to do something, however necessary it may be. If governments can only do what statute law allows them to do, and if statute law doesn't allow them to do it, then, like it or not, you can't do it. That's one issue. The second issue is, okay, suppose that governments do have the power to do these things. Can you challenge it on the basis that it's irrational, that it's disproportionate, and so on? I would not expect the law ever to quarrel with governments on that second point. I would not expect judges to take over the business of deciding whether the health emergency was sufficiently serious to justify these measures. And the objection to the measures is therefore essentially political and moral rather than legal. It's a different story if you're asking yourself, do the governments have power to do this at all? I don't know what the position is in an Australian context. In a British context, a large number of reputable lawyers, including myself, considered that while the government did have power to do it, they didn't have power to do it under the particular act that they chose. And they chose a piece of legislation which on the face of it didn't authorize lockdowns, but had the advantage from the government's point of view that it wasn't subject to the same strict measure of parliamentary scrutiny.
Have you been concerned how police forces have abrogated to themselves the right to determine what the law is and to, in some circumstances, act a long way beyond whatever the laws and the regulations allow them to do. And when they have been identified as stepping beyond those boundaries, they have refused to acknowledge that they've done so.
Well, there's been a lot of that in the United Kingdom. Although it's fair, I mean, we have seen news clips of extraordinarily brutal overreactions by policemen, particularly in Melbourne, which have gone across the world. And to my mind, this is an utterly appalling way to treat human beings in any society, let alone a society which professes it to be humane, itself to be humane and liberal. I think that it is a natural tendency of policemen to use their powers 150%. They have been encouraged to do that by public fear, certainly in the United Kingdom. It is fair to say that in the United Kingdom they have stepped back in the face of protest. In this country, there was an extraordinary outburst of police overreaction. In the first 3 days of our lockdown back in March, the lockdown had no legal effect at all. The government pretended that it did, but the regulations weren't actually made until 3 days after they were announced. Nonetheless, a number of enthusiastic police forces announced that they were going to start applying them immediately. I broadcast on a widely distributed news program on the BBC a protest against this. I got a letter. The protest was specifically directed at a particular county police force that I thought had behaved particularly disgracefully. I got a letter a few days later from the police commissioner of that county who said, well, don't you understand that this is a serious emergency and it's all very necessary? And I replied, I don't care how necessary it is. If you aren't entitled to push people around, you can't do it. It's not for you to decide what's necessary. We have legislatures, we have ministers with statutory powers whose job it is to do that. Your job is simply to apply the law. Now, this response was received by him with a degree of amazement, because when I took part with the same person in a discussion on a television program some months later, after another outburst of excessive enthusiasm by the same police force, he basically sought to justify his position before, by the end of the program, simply caving in. So I think that things may be slightly better in this one respect in the UK than it has been in Australia. If the police have been completely unapologetic in Australia, they haven't been so unapologetic here. We recently had a demonstration on Clapham Common in London to mark people's disgust at the stalking and, in one particular case, the murder of women on the streets. This was brutally broken up by the police. The police in this country have been in a very difficult position because last autumn the government withdrew the exemption for political demonstrations which had previously been included in the regulations. And the Home Secretary ordered the police to enforce the regulations in every detail as strictly as possible. Yet the moment that the police took action against a group with whom the population had a great deal of sympathy, the Home Secretary backtracked and said, oh, this is a most appalling thing. I'm going to call for investigations. Yet she has directly been responsible for what happened.
You've made reference to what's occurred here in Melbourne, which is where I'm speaking to you from. How do you depoliticise the police? So to make reference to, again, what's occurred in Melbourne, I referred to the arrest of Zoe Bueller. There have been many, many other arrests. Protests against the lockdown, against the government, have been very heavily policed and regulated. other protests in direct contravention of health orders and regulations have not only been allowed by the police, but have been positively encouraged by the police. Now, that seems to me to be the police acting under the methods of a police state. How does one change the police, not just enforcing the law, but making political decisions of their own accord without reference to the government or relevant ministers?
We have had exactly the same problem here. Protests against lockdowns have been dispersed with considerable brutality, particularly last September, at a time when demonstrations were in principle lawful, whereas protests against on climate change and Black Lives Matter have been passed through with no problem at all. How does one deal with this? Well, in the UK, there is a thing called the College of Policing, which distributes guidance to every single police constable. And they have been an extremely effective and admirable part of the system. They have produced straightforward guidelines to what the police can or should do and what they can't or shouldn't do. It's a difficult thing to do because the regulations are unbelievably opaque and tortuous. It takes hours to understand them, even for lawyers. So it's nothing short of genius to reduce this to a single A3 size sheet of paper. But that's what they did, and it had a considerable salutary effect.
Can I go to the final video question for today from Rosalind?
Rosalind Smallwood from Victoria, Jonathan. Where do you think an effective rebuttal of the woke mentality is likely to come from?
Well, I wish there were more people who were making the argument in the press, in the broadcast media, on social media and elsewhere. I think sooner or later the message will come through, but not until people stop being frightened. This is not a particularly frightening virus, except for people with identifiable vulnerabilities, commonly but not invariably associated with age. There is no need to be frightened. And so far as one is frightened, there are perfectly effective measures of self-isolation that people can take. Until we get used to the idea that we have got to live with risk, we are not going to get out of this. I hope that the experience of the last year will encourage people to think more seriously about this. But I can't offer a quick fix.
And talking about experience, the next question I have is from Cameron about the experience of history, Lord Sumption. And the question is, this is a question to Lord Sumption, not as a lawyer, but as a historian. Has the decline in our knowledge and understanding of history led to a willingness to have our freedoms eroded? Is it the case that we don't know how hard it has been to win our freedoms over the course of history, and we don't understand how easily they are lost?
I agree with that, but I think that it's the mechanism. The mechanism is a bit more indirect. People who understand the long course of history will understand risk better. That, I think, is the main lesson. We, just looking at disease, we can look back over the centuries and see that human beings have had to live with disease of greater or lesser seriousness since the beginning of time. We can identify risks that are not external catastrophes, but are part of the experience of humanity. And that is an important route to getting some kind of sense of perspective. If you ask if you ask the question, how serious is the current crisis? There are no criteria by which you can answer that question other than historical ones. Well, if it's something that humans have grappled with for hundreds and hundreds of years, then it can't be that extraordinary. It can't be so extraordinary that we should be doing something that nobody has ever done in recorded history. It's a sense of perspective that history gives you. I don't think that history will teach you to value liberties directly, but I think that it may teach you to do that indirectly when you understand what the problems of being human really are.
And on that line of argument, I have a question for you from John from Queensland, who happens to be a lawyer. And he asks, Lord Denning, the eminent jurist, reputedly said, the average Englishman has the absolute right to walk quietly down the street, breathing softly. And John's question is, has the growth and codification of human rights law made any difference to protecting our freedoms? Here in Victoria, I reference the fact that the current Labor government, the Labor state government, passed a Human Rights Act that has been fundamentally disobeyed, breached and broken in nearly everything this state government has done. Have human rights legislations made any difference whatsoever?
They've made no difference to the measures taken in the COVID crisis. And indeed, the silence of the human rights lobbies has been deafening. We have a body in the UK which used to be called the National Council of Civil Liberties, is now called Liberty. It was founded in order to protest against police breakup of demonstrations in the 1930s. Their line on demonstrations against lockdown is that they're not against the police breaking those up, essentially because they think that it's desirable and necessary to enforce the lockdown. So we have the position that the human rights lawyers are really only interested, it seems, in those human rights which are infringed from their end of the spectrum. They're only interested in the protection of views that they support. Now, I'm not going to suggest that that's the view of all human rights lawyers or all human rights enthusiasts, but it's a view of far too many of the more prominent of them.
Can I ask you then, elaborating from that, does that speak to the changing nature of politics? And again, in your Reith Lectures, you talk about how once upon a time the judiciary was seen to be the defenders of unabashed capitalism. Now the situation has changed and judges are relied upon to make more liberal decisions than politicians. What seems to have happened to debates about freedom of speech, the right to dissent, the right to protest is that it is now conservatives, classical liberals, libertarians in a minority, seemingly, arguing against a consensus. Does this speak to you about a permanent change in politics, or is this something transitory in the scheme of 20th century history?
I don't think it's permanent, but it's clearly not transitory either. It's been building up for a long time. I sought to trace in my first Reith Lectures the origins of this, but I think that it's something that started really in a small way with the beginning of mass democracy. And those who supported mass democracy in the 19th century pointed out that this was one of the risks. Famously, John Stuart Mill felt that one of the problems of democracy, of which he was an enthusiastic and rational supporter, is that it tended to lead to conformism and to the suppression of dissent. And he felt that the risk would come not from judges, not from politicians, not from policemen, but from our fellow citizens. And I'm afraid that that was a prescient thing for him to say in 1860.
How have things changed 160 years later? Have they changed at all?
Well, what's changed is public sentiment in exactly the way that you suggested a few minutes ago. People are less tolerant. People want a single collective view on issues that they feel strongly about. People regard dissent as antisocial. It is a part of the feeling that there is it's the desire for solidarity. But solidarity comes in a number of different forms. There is the solidarity of mutual sympathy and support, which is wholly admirable, and there's the solidarity of intolerant conformism. We've got far too much of the second.
On that note, we have time for one last question, and then I'm going to ask you to conclude about the future. Our final question for today is Annabelle from Queensland. Lord Sumption, what do you think will happen next time? Can it get worse, or will governments come to their senses and ultimately trust citizens?
I think that depends on how many next times there are. If it becomes clear that this kind of epidemic disease is something that is going to recur, either COVID-19 itself or other epidemic diseases, frequently, I think that governments will be forced to recognize that they can't do what they have been doing every time. These particular measures on COVID-19 were sold on the basis that this was a horrific once-in-a-century event. I'm not sure that it was right, but that was the way it was sold. If it becomes clear that it's not a once-in-a-century event, but a once-a-year or once every 2-year event, it's simply not going to be a sustainable position. Governments are going to have to live with it, and they're going to have to learn to manage it and not to try and suppress it or turn human life upside down in the attempt. If, on the other hand, we find that epidemics recur, perhaps more frequently than once in a century, but perhaps every 10 or 20 years, I'm afraid that experience of humanity suggests that people will forget, that people will continue to regard this as exceptional and extraordinary and as justifying extraordinary measures. Now, I certainly wouldn't want to be heard saying, I do hope that there's an epidemic every year, but I'm afraid that that may be the only way in which we knock this sort of nonsense out of politicians' heads.
To conclude our wonderful discussion today, can I ask you to locate causes for optimism, causes for hope? You've already identified some today. How do we regain our freedoms? When will our liberties be restored to some extent? And as we've spoken about today, how do we as citizens participate in that process?
I wish that I had an optimistic message about this. But as I said earlier, I think that the ballot box and mass civil disobedience are the only way in which citizens are going to change their position on this. And until they do change their position, we're going to get stuck with this attitude for a long time.
Lord Jonathan Sumption, can I thank you for being a guest on the IPA's Encounters, and on behalf of so many Australians, so many members of the Institute of Public Affairs, can I thank you for what you've done and what you are yet to do, speaking for freedom, speaking for the rule of law, and speaking for the maintenance of our way of life. Thank you for being with us today.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for joining me for the first episode of IPA Encounters, and thank you for sending in your thought-provoking questions for Lord Sumption. IPA Encounters is a monthly online event series exclusively for you as an IPA member. Our next guest for IPA Encounters is former Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson on Tuesday, the 20th of April. And our special guest for May is Sky News presenter Peter Credlin. Don't forget to register at ipa.org.au/encounters.